Emma.
And I'm Helena, and we both work at the MS Trust. And just a little disclaimer, we're recording this over Zoom because of, well, you know what the situation is like by now. So we're still socially distancing. So apologies if the sound is iffy at any stage. Please do bear with us.
Welcome to our series of podcasts in which our volunteer Will of Ask the Expert podcast fame goes behind the scenes at the MS Trust. He'll be interviewing some of the teams who provide the useful information, resources and support to people with multiple sclerosis every day.
And because Will is a volunteer with MS himself, he'll be asking some of those questions that you've maybe always been wondering but never had a chance to ask.
So today, Will will be chatting to the MS Trust CEO, David, as well as our Chair of Trustees, Caitlin, to find out a little bit more about how the MS Trust operates.
And as we have two interviews today, I think we need to jump straight into it. So here's Will and David.
Today it is my great honor to be joined on the program, on the podcast, by David Martin, who's the CEO of the MS Trust, the boss man, the big cheese, the head honcho, the numero uno, the top dog, the kingpin, the big wheel, the alpha cat, the principal alpaca, the juiciest lemon, the prize-winning marrow, the upside-down, but I'm making some of those up, obviously. David has been the head of the MS Trust since 2017. Prior to that, he worked for 10 years with the Papworth Trust, which is a non-profit charity offering support and care to disabled people, elderly people, and of course their families and carer. And then prior to that, he spent 12 years at the BBC, where he started his career. For our international listeners, the BBC is the public broadcaster of a small island nation off the coast of Normandy. In 2018, David became chair of the Neurological Alliance, a non-profit coalition of more than 80 organizations working to better outcomes for the millions of people living with a neurological condition in the UK. We'll talk about this and more, but first let me give our guest the warmest of welcomes. David, hello.
It sounds like it's going to be a great party, Will. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Thanks for taking the time. I'm assuming you're very, very busy. So let's start with a question that's perhaps a bit odd. How would you describe the MS Trust? And of course, on this program, one would hope the listeners have an inkling as to what the MS Trust is and what it does. But speaking to the team, I'm discovering that the scope of the concerns of the MS Trust is much broader than I, for one, as a patient, had any reason to believe. And I assume that you would have the highest point of view and would be able to tell us, the nature and function. Let's say, your 30-second elevator pitch, you're at a cocktail party. We don't have those anymore. But, someone doesn't know and you're trying to kind of describe the organization very briefly. What would you say?
Well, I would say that the MS Trust is a small boutique charity. It's a wonderful place to work. But the things that we do that nobody else does is we provide additional MS nurses into the NHS. And we also provide a role called the Advanced MS Champions. So the 40,000 people living with advanced MS get more help than they would have done from the NHS. So that's fundamentally what we do. And we also provide advice and information to lots of people living with MS too.
Excellent. And so how many people does the trust employ? What's the sort of, material breadth of operation, budget and number of nurses trained, MS Champion program, the size and so on?
Yeah, we've got about 30 members of staff, so we're relatively small compared to many other charities. We are a national charity, so it's in a sense very thinly spread. We spend about £2.5 million a year, but we don't get a penny from the NHS. So every single penny we spend is brought in through fundraising. So those people doing skydives for us, doing cake sales for us, doing marathon runs for us, that money makes such a difference, and that pays for every single thing that we do. And that's helped us to provide 7 additional MS nurses into the NHS so far, and so far 6 advanced MS champions. So not a bad roll call, but we really need to dial up those numbers going forward.
Of course. And so you arrived at the MS Trust and took the helm in 2017. I get the sense there have been a number of changes, both sort of financially and in terms of culture. To be fair, I don't know how much of that is fact and how much of that is, the way you kind of spin things on LinkedIn, because there's some of that too. But perhaps you can tell us about it. What have you put in place? Certainly the advanced MS champion we're talking about, that's something that was under your tenure, wasn't it?
It was, but it was happening just before I arrived. So effectively, I've not made many changes at the trust. I arrived, and inherited this wonderful charity. It knew exactly what it was doing. It was probably spending a little bit too much money. It wasn't watching the bank balance quite closely enough. So I put a few measures in place there. But apart from that, what I've tried to do is grow the confidence of the organisation, because it does such great things right across the country, and it influences around the world. And so what I'm trying to do is grow that confidence to just make sure that we're absolutely proud of what we do. But particularly, I think I've done two changes in particular to make us more proud of the work we're doing for these additional MS nurses and putting in place these advanced MS champions, but also to grow the confidence of what we do, because I think we have much more influence in the wider MS sector than we actually realise. So my job over the last 2 or 3 years in particular has been to try and dial up that external influence, so we can try and make sure that MS has more of a priority in the NHS in particular, and make sure that people are not suffering because of the postcode lotteries up and down the country just because of where they live.
And so, as CEO, it's a term we're obviously more familiar with in the corporate world. What is it practically that you do? I mean, we imagine CEOs as, liaising with the shareholder. It's mostly a communication job, which with your background at the BBC must come in handy. But what's a day in your life looking like, David?
Oh gosh, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because of all 30 staff at the MS Trust, I probably know the least about multiple sclerosis, because I'm not a scientist, I'm not a medic, but my expertise is in communications. But it was felt we have so many experts in MS in the MS Trust that when the trustees were recruiting for a new CEO, they wanted somebody who could help to improve our communications, and particularly to start to influence the external environment, the outside world, both the MS world, the neurological world, and hopefully influence the NHS as well. But I was trying to think about it before our catch up. Well, what a typical day looks like. You think yesterday was there isn't a typical day, but yesterday I was supposed to be reworking the staff handbook, which sounds very dull and very boring, but it's really important. 77 pages of it there is now, because of all the different HR and legal elements that we need to include in that. And then midway through the afternoon, we had The Guardian and Daily Express got in touch, because they were doing a news story about a drug called Fampridine. And they wanted a quote, within half an hour or so. So I could be doing something very boring 1 minute, and all of a sudden you're talking or providing a quote, an urgent quote, to the national media straight away. So your day can change straight away. Much of my time is taken speaking to different people like yourself, Will. So I might be taking part in podcasts, in seminars, in conferences, either sitting around a table or speaking myself. So sharing some thoughts of what the MS Trust is saying and doing. So talking to maybe pharmaceutical companies, talking to other charities, obviously talking to people living with MS themselves, to neurologists, and to the other MS charities, just to making sure that we're more aligned and hopefully we're a bit more shoulder to shoulder. So in the end, we have a bit more impact working together like that. So in a sense, that every day is quite different. And that's what I love about this job. But when I'm flying the flag for the MS Trust, it makes me so proud, because in a sense, for me as the CEO, I'm living, breathing, and sleeping the MS Trust. So the fact I can go out and parade that to people just makes me immensely proud.
Yeah, I'm getting this sense of pride from the way your face is lighting up as you talk about the things. And I think you may be selling yourself a little bit short, because I'm told that you fundraise for the MS Trust as well. So a significant proportion of those 2.5 million come from funds you've raised yourself. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
I don't know. I wouldn't say significant, Will, but thank you for the kind flattery. But I felt when I first joined the trust, I had to do something to show other people. I couldn't ask people to fundraise for the trust if I didn't do it myself. So when I first joined, I signed up for the London to Amsterdam bike ride, which took place over 4 days, and I raised about just over 3,500 from that.
Wow.
And then last year, at the beginning of the pandemic, I just felt that I needed to do something to help to keep my head straight. So I live near Cambridge in England. And so I thought, right, what am I going to do if I'm locked down? I love cycling. I couldn't really go out and cycle. And then somebody in my village was giving away one of these exercise bikes, which literally, normally sits in the study. In most people's study, it doesn't get used. And I thought, what I'm going to try and do is go on a virtual ride and ride the miles on this exercise bike, but do it from Land's End at one end of the UK to John O'Groats at the other end of the UK.
How many miles is that?
It's just over 1,000 miles. So
Wow.
I thought I'm going to do it anyway to keep myself it straight and narrow, to keep myself sane. And I suddenly thought, well, why not fundraise while I'm doing this? So I chucked it out there on Facebook. And I couldn't believe the generosity of people who wanted to support me, but more importantly, wanted to support the MS Trust. And almost overnight, I got about £5,000. So it's one small example of what I can do. But I know that money is going to make a real difference to the life living with people, for people living with multiple sclerosis. So in a sense, it made those 1,000 miles were very easy for me when I knew the difference that money was going to make.
Of course, yeah. It's when you know it's for a good cause, it just you feel the burn, but in slightly different ways. And that, I mean, this is a great example of leading from the front. I think that's kind of very, very inspirational. Now, you mentioned you're not a scientist, and primarily, I think you being a communicator is very helpful to the trust. Evidently, do you have how did you come to this role? Do you have a personal connection to MS? I mean, or to disability? I've seen you with your work at the Papworth Trust.
Yeah, I've been a bit of a generalist before, and when I've been a journalist, I've worked at the BBC, newspapers, even in some pop magazines as well. And then I got approached by a disability charity, a national disability charity called Papworth Trust, and they wanted to increase their external influence. They wanted to go shoulder to shoulder with the likes of Scope and Leonard Cheshire, even though they were a relatively small regional charity. And I helped them to do that over 10 years. And obviously what happened is the MS Trust saw that what had happened just over the border in Cambridge, and they thought they might want a slice of that as well. So they got in touch. We had a few discussions, and I could see the real potential that there was at the MS Trust to be able to do something similar. So I came and joined the MS Trust just over 3 years ago. And I tell you what a fantastic journey. It is quite, I've worked at the BBC, I've worked with some national newspapers, I've worked some great places. This is the best ever job I've ever had. I just love it.
And you're not just saying that, although you are saying that, but we are.
Hand on heart.
So, and then the chairmanship, you're non-executive director of the Neurological Alliance. That's very interesting to me because you mentioned the Papworth Trust and the competition with the competition. Notionally they're rivals of Scope. And I'm French, as you can hear, and I was talking to Helena, who also has MS and worked. Listeners will be familiar with her voice from the podcast, and she's Swedish. And those are both sort of kind of big government socialized medicine type, sort of very much more monolithic. So it's both interesting and somewhat puzzling to us to see the idea that within the charity sector, which is picking up a lot of the stuff that, I mean, in my view, should be done by the state. So, for instance, training the MS nurses, to be fair, that shouldn't be on you. It's great you're doing it, but why should it be dependent on the goodwill of people? But also, concerningly, I mean, of course, the invisible hand of the market and so on, but the idea of competition between charities leaves a bit of a pinch in the mind, this concern that perhaps there's duplication of effort, or they end up competing for the same funds and sort of spending more money to raise the same amount of money because it's ultimately targeting the same people. Now, the Neurological Alliance, I'm getting the sense, is an effort to aggregate on a broader scope all of those charities. The Neurological Alliance is evidently an effort to aggregate all of those charities working in long-term disability and neurological conditions. But how do you deal with that? Do you sort of ever do crossover events with other charity? Do you liaise to try not hold fundraising events on the same weekend? Is there a bit of gentle rivalry, or is it more fierce than that?
There's lots of gentle rivalry, and it might be a bit more fierce than that. I think charities overall should collaborate a bit more together, and that's where, for me, the Neuro Alliance comes in. So I saw about 18 months ago that how influential the Neurological Alliance is across the neurological sector. So I started looking outside, and I thought, if the MS Trust is going to get anywhere, we need to get more heavily involved in the Neuro Alliance. So I knocked on the door of the alliance and said, can we be involved? Fortunately, they had a vacancy at the time. They said, why don't you come onto the board? And it's interesting because I hold my hand up. I'm not a scientist. I know nothing about neurological diseases, by and large. I know a bit about MS. But again, they needed some help with their communications at that time. So they thought I'd be a good addition to the fold. And then very quickly, the chair sadly decided to stand down. They needed a new chair, and I got a tap on the shoulder. Now, I think why this is important, because it could be, some people might see this as a distraction for me at the MS Trust, but the reality is I probably spend less than half a day a week in my work with the Neurological Alliance. we work at the Alliance with more than 80 different charities of the likes of Parkinson's, MNDA, the MS Society, Sue Ryder. So I'm working with chief execs and directors of some of the biggest charities in the country. So there's a real opportunity to try and influence there. But what I'm trying to do, the Neurological Alliance is trying to ensure that neurology overall is taken more seriously by the NHS, because roughly about 1 in 6 people live with a neurological problem at some point during their life. So, and they don't get the right support. My sense within that is MS is very much a second-rate issue for many people. So more people have MS than have Parkinson's. Parkinson's is right up there, meantime, little old MS is down there somewhere. So my role within the Neuro Alliance privately is to try and make sure that multiple sclerosis is a much higher priority in the Neuro Alliance, and then therefore within the NHS. And I think I'm starting to see some small green shoots as part of that work so far.
That's great. And certainly, I think we could add to this list of neurological condition long COVID, which is, it's fresh off the block. It's the hot new one. We don't know much about it, but expect that within the next couple of years, we might see more and more patients. And of course, there's going to be need for charity, for communication, for activism, help and support. So speaking about COVID in general, we're recording this in August of 2021 for the record. What was how has the pandemic impacted both the MS Trust itself, but its broader role within the health system and with the patients?
I think the pandemic has been horrendous. First of all, for the MS Trust, a year, 15 months ago, we had a big question mark over our future. We had some real financial challenges, and we had to make some changes very, very quickly to make sure that the MS Trust stayed alive. So I had to make, with my fellow directors, some very difficult decisions. A handful of jobs had to go. We had to cut our spending. We had to tighten our belts, and all of the staff went down to a 4-day week for 6 months to make sure that we could balance our books, simply because a lot of our fundraising in 2021 all but dried up like that. So for example, when the marathon was postponed in 2020, in one day, that was £165,000 that we lost. So there was a lot of money that simply didn't. Yeah, just like that.
Just like that.
Yeah, just like that. And we'd already projected we were going to get that money in. So there was some sleepless nights for me making those sort of changes. 4 jobs doesn't sound a lot, but 4 and 30, that's a lot. And I saw tears. Those were people that I know and loved. And that was really, really difficult to do. But I now know that taking those hard decisions at the time was absolutely the right thing to guarantee that the MS Trust is here now and will be here next year and be its 30th birthday the year afterwards. So it was the right thing to do. But what I've seen more broadly is the pandemic has had a huge and adverse impact on the neurological sector in particular. So the waiting lists were pretty bad anyway. Those waiting lists have really stretched over the last year or so. There are probably around 10,000 people now who are now having to wait over a year to see their neurologist. That's just horrendous. That's not acceptable in 21st century Britain. But so it means that some people are going to have to wait so long that if they have an issue, their disability is going to get worse and worse and worse. So I think we're going to be living with these problems for years to come. And at the moment, I'm not seeing any sort of solution on how that's going to be fixed.
That's going to be a complex question. But thankfully, in terms of fundraising, the MS Trust did manage to pivot and encourage, fundraising from home with that festival. That was a very good one. There's the MS Play, although that predates COVID, but those kind of events. And if you're listening to this, mstrust.org.uk/donate. Just, do your bit. No pressure. Now, David, you've mentioned the budget, £2.5 million a year. You mentioned that you do not get a penny from the NHS or indeed the government. But, of course, not all of this is fundraising and donations. You also partner with the industry, in particular the pharmaceutical industry, for better or for worse. Could you tell us a bit more about that? They help you organize I think it's every 18-month conference?
Yeah, no, we have a good working relationship with the all of the big pharmaceutical companies in the MS space. Now, what we do, I meet with them probably every 3 months or so, different representatives from those different organizations, and we do get some funding from them. So without those pharmaceutical companies, we couldn't run our MS Trust conference, and we couldn't do the great training that we do with the new MS nurses on what we call our development program. So fundamentally, they're an important part of what we do. But so what we do, we put each of those amounts on our website, so we don't hide it away. We're very open, we are very transparent, and we don't deny that money. But I can promise you, Will, that how that money is spent and what it's spent on is decided by me and my fellow directors. So we get the money from pharmaceutical companies, we give them a rough idea of where we might be spending it on. So it might be a conference, it might be training, it might be on new MS nurses, but which nurse and which area is going to benefit from that is decided by the MS Trust alone. So I think it's a good and robust relationship with the pharmaceutical companies, but hopefully it's 100% transparent at the same time and not something I want to deny.
Of course, it's great that I can hear that you're obviously standing your ground, and just because they're giving you the money, they don't get to have a say as to how it's spent, and that's great. Because the problem with my mother used to work in a pharmaceutical company, so I have perhaps a kind of view, but Big Pharma has this reputation, and donors, corporate donors, nothing's for free, there's always strings attached, so that's always a concern. Actually, I was sitting on a Zoom with the MS Register patient group, and this chap was presenting a study, and everyone was fascinated, very interested, until at the bottom of one slide we saw it was sponsored by Merck, and then there was this collective sharp intake of breath of like, oh, how much do we trust something that comes from the industry? And yeah, it has to be approached with caution, but it sounds like you've got a handle on this. That's great.
Absolutely. And they do try to influence us. So in my regular meetings with them, for example, they know how influential the decision tool is for people who are newly diagnosed with MS. I know it's used at so many MS centres up and down the country. So occasionally I come under influence to try and alter and adjust the decision tool and what we say about the different drugs. And we push back very firmly on that. So we're happy to have a conversation, but when it comes down to the final decision, that final decision is ours and ours alone.
I'd like to take I'd like to take this opportunity actually to delve a little bit deeper, or just a quick mention of some of the things you have talked about. The decision tool, you can go on the MS Trust website, mstrust.org.uk, and it's about helping you with the cost-benefit analysis of choosing a disease-modifying drug. I've made podcasts about it. We know it's always a bit of a complicated one, figuring out the benefit and side effect. The decision tool, it's on the MS Trust website, mstrust.org.uk, at the top, resources, and it's going to be the first thing that comes up, compare disease-modifying drugs. The other thing you've talked about, and I think we should highlight it a little bit more because that could be a source of funds, is legacy. It means that you can leave part of what you own to the MS Trust in your will. Am I speaking out of turn, David? Is that right?
No, absolutely, that's spot on. But legacies can make such a huge difference to charities like the MS Trust. We are so reliant on the generosity of people who give us money, whether it's a legacy, whether it's a cake sale, whether it's running a marathon. So from legacies in particular, what it is, if people have enough money in their will, they maybe hopefully they have something that's a bit of spare money in there. If they leave that money to us, we can guarantee that that money can be spent on MS nurses, it can be spent on champions, it can be spent on the inquiry line. So if they want to identify a particular area that they want that money to be spent. But because we're a small charity, we are only 30 members of staff, we've got a small HQ, people lend us the money, it doesn't go into admin, it doesn't go into a huge pot and then just forgotten. That money does make a difference. So we're trying to increase our focus, increase the priority that the new legacies can help us with, really, and trying to shout a bit more about that as we go forward. So I think you'll be hearing more about the difference that legacies can make for organizations like the MS Trust in the near future.
I look forward to this. So if you want to get involved, it's simply on the website. At the top, there is a menu called Get Involved, in which you will find Donate, Fundraising and Events, so cake sales and food stuff to do whilst you're alive, and Legacies and In Memory, so you can help, after you're not alive anymore. And on a slightly cheerier note, I'm told that you got a lockdown puppy.
I got a lockdown puppy. Yeah, it was mad. I also had a milestone birthday earlier this year, earlier in 2021. So I was asked by my family, what is it? What was it I really wanted? I'm really into music. I'm really into cycling, but I haven't had a dog for a couple of years. So I got a spaniel. He's called Remy. Remy's named after the rat chef in Ratatouille. So I've got 3 grown-up children, all of them in the 20s. So we got a WhatsApp group going, and in the end, we had about 100 names. Couldn't agree on the name till Remy came up. And because my surname is Martin, so he's also Remy Martin, or Remy Martin, named after the brandy. And he's a real live wire and a character. And in a sense, what he does, I take him for a walk twice a day. And I share my problems with him. I walk by the river. I see the kingfishers. I see the other dog walkers. But it helps me to get my brain straight as we're sort of walking through the lanes in the village of where I live. So he's a great asset, and he's actually sitting at my feet at the moment. But I'd love to lift him up, but if I try and pick him up at the moment, he'll run away.
So I'm told he can be a bit boisterous and interrupt your video calls as well. Which, I mean, lockdown pets, that's the great joy. Pets are such a joy.
Yeah, absolutely,
there's so much help. So you've talked in some degree of detail with the challenges the MS Trust is facing, both generally as a charity in the neurological disability sector, but very specifically during the pandemic, and the difficulty to try and move along a health system that is huge, and of course there's a lot of inertia, there's a lot of good intention, but sometimes it's difficult to action things. What if you could name your top 3 challenges and hoped for improvements that you would love to see to progress, what would you say?
Well, firstly, I'd love there to be a cure for multiple sclerosis, first and foremost. Now, that's not what we're doing. That's the work that the MS Society is doing. I'm also always being challenged by the fact, why isn't there just one MS charity? But it's a bit like, in the MS space, it's a bit like Cancer Research UK, Macmillan. You've got the MS Society looking for a cure. We at the MS Trust are doing everything to ensure people living with MS are having the best lives that they possibly can.
In the meantime, yes, that's right.
In the meantime, so I wish that, I hope there's some great work going on, but if there's one single thing that's going to happen, I wish that there was a cure for MS. But in the meantime, there is work for me and my colleagues at the MS Trust to do. So that's number 1. Number 2, I'd really like there to be more MS nurses up and down the country. There's a shortage at the moment. We're doing some work at the moment to understand what that gap is, but we know that there are some MS nurses, and they should have a caseload of roughly about 320 people living with MS to ensure that they can give reasonable support to those people, that can be available on the phone to respond to emails and see people face to face. We know in some parts of the country, there are some MS nurses with caseloads of more than 1,000 people.
Wow.
Now that is just not on. So if I could do number 2 would be to have probably 200 additional MS nurses up and down the country. And that would, I believe, transform the lives of people living with multiple sclerosis. And then number 3, and I'm going to say it, but I think it's having more advanced MS champions. So you've got roughly about 130,000 people living with multiple sclerosis at the moment, and around a third of them have something called advanced, they're defined as having something called advanced MS. So the NHS is there for them, but can't do much for them. So by and large, they're living at home, they're supported by the carers, they're supported by their families. Formally, the NHS does look after them. Informally, they don't get a huge amount of support. Now, we know with the 6 advanced MS champions that we've created, that those roles can make a fundamental difference to those lives of people living with MS, those advanced people with advanced MS. Of those 40,000 people, if we had another 30 or 40 advanced MS champions, that would be life-changing. So a cure for MS, maybe 20 more nurses up and down the country, MS nurses up and down the country, and a swathe of advanced MS champions. And that would simply transform the MS sector and the lives of people living with MS.
I like those because, of course, the top one is very much an ideal, but the other 2 are definitely achievable. Do you think you can get to those numbers within the next 2, 3, 5 years?
At the moment, I really wish we could, but at the moment, I'm not sure that we can. I think before the pandemic, The trust was evolving. We're starting to understand the difference that we can make in different spaces. But the challenge is getting in enough money. Now, we could grow the trust very, very quickly, but I don't want to do that. We could possibly raise loads and loads of money at the trust and then transform that into nurses and transform that into champions. But I think that would be the wrong way to do it. So what I'd much rather do is keep doing what we're doing now, but trying to persuade the bigwigs at the NHS that actually nurses, MS nurses, additional MS nurses, and advanced MS champions are game changers. They can transform the lives of people living with MS. And why can't areas up and down the country introduce those roles themselves? And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to gather that evidence and then use that evidence to influence people up and down the country to do it too.
Excellent. Yeah, it's about getting the getting the data, because we know that what you're doing leads to better outcomes. It's just being able to capture those, quantify those, and put those results in front of decision makers so you can get more support and more people involved. Well, thank you very much for your time, David. This was extremely insightful. I feel very privileged that you've taken some time to indulge my little, especially since you're a proper journalist. I mean, of course, that, yeah. Just leave us on this. What is next for the MS Trust and for 2022? What do we have to look forward to?
I think one of the things I'm really looking forward to, Will, is we've just received one of the biggest legacies we've ever received at the MS Trust. It's very close to 7 figures. So it's given us the opportunity to think about what would we do if we got a large chunk of money, a legacy. And we got notice of a legacy late last year. So we've had a bit of thinking this, over the last 6 months or so. And what we're going to do is trying to engage more with more people living with MS. Now, we do that pretty well already at the moment, and I know Helen has told you lots about this, and I think in particular, our Facebook group with more than 13,000 people involved in that, it's just fantastic. But my sense is there's still lots of people living with MS who don't have much of a voice in the sector. So what we're going to try and do is explore what else is there that we can do. Now, it could simply be dialing up that Facebook group. It could be doing stuff on Insta. It could be doing stuff on Twitter and LinkedIn. But I think it's something more substantive in that. But what is it that we at the MS Trust can do to give more of a voice to more people with MS so they've got more of a say, not just at the MS Trust, but right across the MS sector? Now, it could be that this could be quite scary. We might create that voice, and those voices might tell us that what we're doing at the trust might be wrong, and we might need to do something different. But hopefully, it will also tell the powers that be at the NHS, the different hospitals, and the different centres that actually they might need to be doing something different as well. So I think we're taking quite a leap of faith. It's quite a big risk, but I think fundamentally it could be a bit of a game changer going forward. So a bit of a risk, but I think really exciting at the same time.
Great. Well, David Martin, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for the grilling, Will.
Now, if this was a commercial podcast, here's where there would be an advert. But as we're a charity, we don't do that. So instead, we'd like to take the opportunity to tell you about our fantastic resources for people with MS.
Our website, which is mstrust.org.uk, has tons of information and resources for people affected by MS. So just head over to www.mstrust.org.uk to take a look for yourself. Over there you can find things like personal stories from people who've been diagnosed with MS. We've got a useful resource which is our A to Z guide, so you can go and have a quick search by obviously alphabetical order and look up any symptoms you'd like to find out more about. And there's also some great things like how to get involved with fundraising on there too. Now let's move on to the second part. So here's Will with our Chair of Trustees, Caitlin.
It is now my great pleasure to be joined by Caitlin, who's the chair of the board of trustees, and I will let her explain what each of those words mean in a second. Caitlin, hello.
Hello.
How long have you been working at the MS Trust, and in what capacity?
So I think it's about 5 years now. I joined as a trustee about 5 years ago. Before that, I'd done some fundraising for the MS Trust, mainly by running the London Marathon. And then I applied to become a trustee and joined the board, about 5 years ago.
And so the board, we mentioned the board, so this is like, I expect charities work like this in general, right? There is a CEO, but behind there is a board of trustees. Could you explain a little bit about what the board of trustees do? What are the responsibilities? What's your relationship with regards to David? We interviewed just before. That's is more the MD to the board of directors, if we were to take a corporate analogy. Is that right?
Yeah, so the best way of describing it is that David and his team are responsible for the operational day-to-day running of the MS Trust. The role of the Board of Trustees is to set the strategic direction, but also they play a governance role. So that means that the Board of Trustees has to make sure that the charity is on solid financial grounds, but also that we are true to our aims, that we are managed in accordance with all the charity governance and all the recommendations that charities should adhere to, and that we are using all our resources to best further our aims, in other words, to best help people with multiple sclerosis.
How many people sit on the board?
Well, that's a good question. I think we have 12 or possibly 13 trustees. It fluctuates over time. People join and people leave, but we have about somewhere between 12 and 13 trustees, depending on the time of year or who we've just recruited or who has just left. And during board meetings, we meet with David and his senior management team in order to discuss what's going on at the trust and make decisions and review finances.
And specifically as the chair within the board, do you have, say, the final word when there's I don't know how decisions are made. Is it unanimous, how they vote? Well, how do you have more authority, or is it more a sort of four-person rapporteur, if you will?
So I think if you had a look on the charity governance websites, some charities may have a chair who has the final say. In reality, I think the way that the MS Trust has always been run is that the chair is there to facilitate the meetings and to help the board make decisions, not necessarily by having a casting vote, but by making sure that the discussion is properly explored. And we don't seek unanimous decisions, but we do seek majority decisions. So the chair's role is to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to have an input, that everybody has understood the points that were made and raised, that everybody has had an opportunity to discuss, to understand, and then we move to making decisions.
And so what led you mentioned the fundraising. So if you were, I might, in a way, I almost see my own future in this interview. You see, you start as a fundraiser, you get yourself involved in various capacities until it escalates and that kind of thing. What led you to apply to join the board? And do you have any personal connection to multiple sclerosis yourself?
Yes, I do. 14 years ago, my husband started having symptoms that were very confusing and quite alarming. We went through a whole raft of diagnostic tests, and we spent 4 years in limbo, not knowing what exactly it was that ailed him. Although we had already started looking at the MS Trust website and other websites, and I think during those 4 years we had gathered enough information that we were fairly confident that he had MS. But it took 4 years before he had a spinal tap that confirmed it. And so he was diagnosed 11 years ago now. So our MS journey started 15 years ago. And then a few years after that, his brother, my brother-in-law, was also diagnosed with MS. So it's important to our family. And I like to say that although I don't have an MS and I don't know what it's like to have MS, I know what it's like to live with MS because it's a shared experience that we've been through. The stress of having symptoms that are confusing, the stress of being diagnosed, the stress of learning to cope with the progression of the disease. It's a daily reality for me, which is why which is why I approached the MS Trust and applied to be a trustee, why I started fundraising for them, because obviously it's we jokingly say it's our self-interest charity.
Do you think it's because of the information mission of the trust, the fact that you mentioned that even before diagnosis you had stumbled, across their information, that attracted you to say the MS Trust as opposed to, many other MS charities are available, as they say on the BBC, but say the Society or MS UK or?
So that's a really good question, and obviously I can post-rationalise, and I'm probably quite biased because knowing now what I know now, I'm probably interpreting historical decisions. But this much I know: when my husband was diagnosed, his neurologist said, well, there are a variety of treatments you can go on to, and you might want to check out this decision-making tool. And I vividly remember sitting in front of the laptop, tragically the same laptop that I'm looking at you on now, which just goes to show how little we've invested in technology in all these years.
If it's still running, it's to your credit. You must have a very, very clean air and don't install anything bad on it.
So we were looking at this same laptop screen and going through the decision-making tool. And I remember thinking at the time that it's probably more common now, but certainly 10 years ago, it was for us completely unexpected that as a patient, you weren't just told by your neurologist, this is what you have, this is the treatment you need to go on, this is the outcome that you're going to see. It was, well, there are different treatments, it's up to you, it depends on, and the fact that it was just the two of us in front of the screen making the decision. And I don't know what we would have done if it hadn't been for that decision-making tool that sort of took us through step by step. And so when we came to start fundraising seriously and looking to apply to do the London Marathon, we were naturally attracted to the MS Trust because it had been there at such a pivotal moment, at such an emotionally charged pivotal moment. So that was one factor. The other factor is that so we applied to fundraise for the MS Trust. We also applied for London Marathon places for other MS charities, and the MS Trust got back in touch immediately, were in constant contact with us because they were quite impressed that my husband with MS was about to run a marathon. They sort of interviewed us, took some pictures, and it felt as if the MS Trust was small enough to care while still having enough weight to make a real difference in our lives when we were going through our disease journey. So for us, it was the fact that they're quite small, quite personable. We had direct contact with people at the MS Trust, but at the same time, that decision-making tool was so life-changing.
It's very interesting. So I'm picking up on several points here. What you're saying about the decision-making tool is true that in the 2000, where the start of the landscape of disease-modifying drug becoming very confusing and needing things like that, but also from all that. I mean, admittedly, I tend to hear it from people that are people with MS on the MS Trust podcast, right? But then a number of people mentioned finding out MS Trust information, and in particular this decision, this DMD tool, very early. And so that makes obviously a very good first impression. The second point is really about the, small enough to care, but large enough to make a difference. David used the term boutique. I wonder if something you'd agree with. And I wonder as well, like, how much does this manifest and inform the operations of the board? Typically, the specific question, for instance, is that are there any things that you would disregard or not consider doing because they would be too big and you're aiming at a sort of more homely scale?
So I don't know if we would decide not to do them because we're smaller scale. It's more, we are constrained by our resources. We aren't the biggest charity in the MS space, but we are very good at what we do. And therefore, as I said to you earlier, the role of the board is to make sure that we are being true to our strategic aims and that we are making the most of the resources that we have. So, for example, we don't invest in research because to invest in research, you need an awful lot of money that we don't have. So we could spend 90% of our budget on research and still not make a difference. Whereas by working in a very hands-on way with MS nurses and allied health professionals, we can make a big difference whilst still managing our resources in a most effective manner.
Yeah,
so
this is why I wanted to have those meet the teams interviews, because as I now understand much clearer, but always had a bit of an inkling that the idea, as you said, like they've sort of, you've decided research, that's not what you're going to do, and you focus on what you do best, which is both the health professional vertical and the information vertical. But of course, from the patient point of view, the information is very, very prominent, but maybe not all people with MS who have a MS nurse know that their MS trust would have been formed and trained by the trust. So hearing from the health professional team and hearing from the decision maker, I wonder if you could tell us more a little bit about that strategy. Am I getting that right? The idea of like it's information and the health professional angle.
Absolutely. So it's about making sure that people with MS have the best information available to them in whatever way they want to access it, whether that's book form, whether that's internet, whether that's through our phone lines. But it's also making sure that that health professionals have the right information to be able to support people with MS. Because actually, if you are, research develops so quickly, and as we saw with COVID just in the last 2 years, things move so fast. As an MS nurse, how on earth do you even keep up with that level of information, with that level of research, publication? What effect is COVID going to have on people with MS? What effect are the vaccinations going to have? How does that interfere with my DMDs, etc., etc.? That's so we're about training nurses, supporting them, supporting all allied health professionals throughout their roles to make sure that they can in turn support people with MS. And we've taken it even one step further with our advanced MS champions and our specialist nurse program by saying it's not just about making sure that those professionals are trained and have all the information they need, it's also making sure that there are enough of those health professionals. We'd love to have way more resources to be able to put nurses everywhere, because we know that there aren't enough MS champions, there aren't enough nurses, there aren't enough physios, psychologists, health professionals generally who understand and who can really support MS, people with MS. But if we can just keep chipping away, but more importantly, what we're trying to do by funding some specialist nurses and advanced MS champions is prove to the NHS that these roles make a massive difference. Not only do they make a difference to the lives of people with MS, but they also make a difference to the NHS by reducing emergency hospital admissions. So we're really trying to prove that they help people with MS and they are actually cost effective. So it goes back to, we don't have enough money to fund MS nurses everywhere, so we have to be smarter. We have to put a few in post. We have to prove to the NHS that it's really worth doing, and hope that from there, more and more posts will become available in the NHS because they'll see that there's benefits in doing it.
And you've touched upon COVID-19. What specific impact, from your point of view, was there on both the MS services and the MS Trust and the interface of those two things? The training and.
So the impact that COVID has had on everybody obviously has been, I don't think 2 years ago we could even have imagined the impact that the pandemic would have on the whole population, but even more so on people with MS, because suddenly if you're if you're clinically vulnerable, to suddenly be even more at risk. And the people who had to shield, lockdown was difficult enough when we were allowed to leave our houses to at least go for a walk, but just imagine if you were completely in lockdown. I don't know how those people coped. But not only that, but it had such an enormous impact on the NHS as a whole. And I saw some statistics at the MS Trust conference about how it has slowed down the number of people who've been diagnosed, how it has slowed down the number of referrals to neurologists, and the number of MS services where clinicians were diverted to the front line add those three things together, and the impact that it has had on MS services is absolutely devastating. Not only that, but even as MS services are starting to reopen and, neurologists are starting to see new patients, I spare a thought for the poor clinicians who've been through something incredibly traumatic and are expected to just pick up where they left off. One of the things that really hit home for me was at the MS Trust conference. I heard so many MS nurses and so many physios talk about how worried they were about their patients deconditioning. And I'm very lucky that although my husband's diagnosis has shifted from relapsing remitting to secondary progressive, in fact during lockdown in July last year, he's still able to get out, he's still able to walk, to run a bit, and in fact he'd be mortified if you heard me say run a bit. Still run, still faster than me. But I can only imagine that people who aren't able to be that active and that mobile, the fact that services were shut down, that access to physios was limited, the deconditioning and the way that will have accelerated the progression of their disease is absolutely heartbreaking. And
do you think we can catch up on this? I mean, so for instance, a lot, I mean, it's affected humanity across the board, right? And so I'm retraining in education, and education, of course, like loads of, particularly at certain critical years, and that's like, talk about traumatic, but also for the learning, I mean, the lost learning. And so the DFE has, earmarked and budget, they named the SAR. So when they name it SAR, it's always, things are going to happen, usually a revolution of the Russian style. But do you think that is something we can push to say, okay, how about making more hours of physio available, making more, kind of try and catch up on this, or is this kind of lost forever and we can just have to make our peace with it?
I would love to think that we can catch up. Certainly, I'd like to think we can accelerate from where we are now, but I fear that some of the damage will never be completely rectified, that some of that, I fear that what has happened to the NHS will have a lasting impact, and that we will still be feeling it in years to come. And I would love to see the government make a lot more money available to make sure that services were properly funded, regardless of whether they're COVID facing or not. Just, we need more funding, but then, yeah.
Caitlin, what exciting things are on the horizon for 2022 at the MS Trust?
Lots of exciting things on the horizon. So one of the exciting things is that MS services are starting to open up. So we've managed to run development modules, we managed to run our conference, albeit on an online format, and we are relaunching our specialist MS nurse program. So we're starting to recruit again and put nurses back in post, which just fills me with hope and optimism for the future that we are going to get services back up and running again. That's one exciting thing that's on the horizon. We are making permanent a lot, hopefully all of our advanced MS champion roles that were a pilot. So it's great that those are increasingly being confirmed, and I'd love to see every single one of them made permanent. And then we have some exciting things in the pipeline, and I'm not sure how much I can reveal, but there is a big project that was just approved by the board at the most recent meetings, where we are going to really reach out to people with MS and improve the extent to which we listen to their voices, to their views, and really make sure that we go back to basics in terms of making sure that everything that we do is informed by feedback from people with MS, and making sure that we really tailor what we do to what it is that people with MS want us to do, that we reflect all people with MS in all their diversity of views, of levels of ability, so that we are really representative of all kinds of MS, all kinds of people with MS, and of the broadest possible spectrum of people with MS across the UK.
And finally, this is the final question for all of our guests. What's one piece of advice for someone that may be either recently diagnosed or having a bit of a time with their MS? And I'm curious as to the advice you're going to give, because both from the point of view of being the chair of the board of a multiple sclerosis charity, but also the partner and the sister-in-law of patients with MS.
It's difficult for me to pick one. If I could, I'd pick two. Am I allowed to?
Oh, yeah, of course.
So the first piece of advice I would give is don't panic. Everybody's MS is different. Don't immediately jump to the worst case scenario. It might not be as bad as some of the mental perceptions that you have of MS. And just take it one day at a time, and only you can know how your MS is going to unfold over time. So when my husband was diagnosed, I immediately envisaged wheelchairs and all sorts of things that I thought MS would bring. Actually, MS has brought completely different things into our life, and things that I hadn't even thought about. So last weekend we were at a music festival. Knowing where the nearest toilet is far more important than I'd imagined wheelchair access. No, knowing where the nearest toilet is has become such an important thing in our lives that, how they say police people, when they walk into a room, they're already scoping out where the threats might come from. I walk somewhere new and immediately I'm like, where are the toilets? So yeah, don't panic. Take it one step at a time. You don't know what the outcome is going to be. And also, you will be accompanied throughout. There are medical professionals and charities that are there to support you. The second piece of advice I would give is, for us, a little bit of financial planning went a long way. So to be able to think about, well, what if my husband can't work in the future? How do we manage our finances? How do we, we checked our critical and life insurance on our mortgage. We found out what his private health insurance was able to do. It was just basically about looking at all the support that's available and doing a bit of financial planning that really helped give us the breathing space to be more positive about the future.
I'm glad you tacked the second one on there, because the first one, as obviously very accurate in what it is, of course, you can imagine that's the sensible answer that anyone who's worked in the MS space will give. But the second one seems much more specific. It made me realize that I haven't done that. Although I think the last podcast I cut for the MS Trust get this father of three that said that, when you get there's life insurance and stuff like that. And I don't even know what life insurance is, actually.
It's so the other thing we did is put wills in place, and actually it was my husband's impending diagnosis that prompted us to get married. So everything is a negative.
That's excellent. Yeah. Caitlin, thank you very, very much. I'll let you return to it. It was a pleasure to chat with you.
Thank you, Will. Bye.
It was interesting to hear. Obviously, we've met Caitlin a few times to come into the office and chatting to us, although it's been less of it now because of Corona. But I think it's always interesting to hear the connection that people who choose to become trustees of organizations have. And obviously, Caitlin did a very inspiring talk about training for running the London Marathon and fundraising. So I know her and her husband are been very involved for a long time. And it was nice to hear the connection on how she and her husband used the MS decision as well, and what a difference it can make. And then how that led on to becoming the person in charge.
Yeah, I think, like you say, it's really nice just to hear that trustees, you hear about trustees at different charities, but you don't quite know why they're potentially qualified to have that role, if that makes sense. So it was really nice to hear from Caitlin about some of her own experiences, and she sort of openly said that although she doesn't have MS herself, she's sort of got as close to it as she could get without having MS herself, and has sort of learnt a lot of things about the condition through her husband, and has obviously been a long-term supporter of us. So she kind of lives and breathes the MS Trust.
Yeah. And I think also, obviously I worked for the MS Trust for quite a long time, but before then I came from a corporate background, so I had no idea how board of trustees and how that worked. So it's quite interesting to sort of see what the setup is like. And I particularly like that, our trustees do have some sort of link to MS, maybe that some people are just interested in it because, we've had neurologists or other type of health professionals on there, or people who have MS themselves, or they have MS in the family. I think it's just nice to know that we're sort of in good hands if people have the same sort of, the people that use the MS Trust as a service user are also the people who are part of the trustee board.
Yeah, definitely. If they're the ones who are sort of having a say in where the trust goes in the future, and sort of talking about where they're going to steer the next project, perhaps, it's always good to know that they've sort of got people with MS's best interests at heart, and they can really relate to the cause.
Yeah, and as Caitlin was sort of mentioning when Will asked how many trustees we have, I mean, people do sort of leave, and we recruit for new ones now and again as well. So if you're interested in things like this, you might want to become our new trustee. So always keep a look on our website to see if there are any positions going, because we do like to have a nice diverse board. And obviously there is information on our website if you want to know about the rest of the management team and the trust and things. So, we've spoken mostly about Caitlin now, but it's also interesting to hear what David had to say. And I particularly like stories about his dog. But I mean, you've also got yourself a lockdown dog, haven't you, Emma? Yeah.
I don't know if you can hear her in the background. I was just saying a moment ago she was having a little bit of a strop. So our puppy hasn't been with us for very long, so she's sort of just getting used to things. So unfortunately you may hear her in the background of some of the podcasts coming up.
She'll be the third host.
yeah definitely.
But I like what David was saying about when he goes for a walk and he'll chat to Remy, and Remy will sort of help him work through problems as well, because you often don't really think about when people are CEOs and things, they obviously still need to talk things out, and they have their worries and things. So I like that. It's almost like a therapy dog. I like that.
Yes, definitely. Everyone should get a therapy dog, unless you're allergic, of course.
Can have a therapy goldfish instead, maybe.
Mm-hmm. As Helena mentioned, if you'd like to know more about the work that the MS Trust does, including more about our Board of Trustees and Caitlin, visit mstrust.org.uk and click on the What We Do tab at the top.
And remember, if you have any questions about MS, we're here for you. Our inquiry service is available from Monday to Friday, except UK bank holidays, from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Outside of these hours, you can leave us a message and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Call our inquiry service on 0800 032 38 39, or you can email us on ask@mstrust.org.uk.
You can also find us on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. And you can find this podcast on Spotify, Google and Apple Podcasts, as well as Amazon Music. Get in touch if there are any topics you'd like to hear more about. And of course, don't forget to give us a like and a subscribe.
And we'd also like to say a big thank you to Adam Chapman for the music to this podcast, and of course to volunteer Will, and to Caitlin and David for the involvement in the podcast.